All right, Mike, thank you for joining me. Uh, I've really been looking forward to this. You're doing almost exactly what I want to be doing, and I don't know if there's anyone else doing it quite like you are. So this is exciting for me.
Cool,
Um,
man. I'm
yeah,
excited to be here.
yeah. So what you're doing is you're a physical therapist and a personal trainer for combat athletes. And so tell me real quick, like how'd you end up in that niche? Were you into the combat world first, or the training world first, or did it all just kind of flow together for you?
So I started jiu-jitsu in college, and then after college I just all I really did was just train. And at the time my coach, he started fighting, and I was kind of his main training partner. One time he goes to me, "Hey, do you want to fight?" I never even thought it was possible. So then I start going down that road, and I start training and I start fighting. A few years later, I kind of come to the crossroad. Before this, I was kind of considering, I'm like, you know, if you're going to be a professional mixed martial artist, you really need to get in the UFC. And if you're not going to get in the UFC, you're really not going to get any money, um, especially back when I was doing it, which was like 10 years ago. So it was either, try to become a professional mixed martial artist, but make money, which I didn't think I was good enough to get in the UFC. I could open a jiu-jitsu gym, or I could do something else. So, I started looking. I was actually thinking about being a personal trainer first. At the time, I don't think I had the social skills to really be a good personal trainer, because as a personal trainer, you're a salesman. So then I was like, kind of like, what else can I do? And then I stumbled across physical therapy. Um, I didn't actually think that I was going to be able to combine the two worlds. It was just, I knew that there was some similarities, and doing jiu-jitsu for a long time, I had some injuries, so I was kind of interested. So I started going down the physical therapy road, and then it wasn't until like a year after I graduated that I realized I could combine them.
Hmm. Yeah, so that's honestly pretty similar to the position I'm in. I got into martial arts maybe 3 years ago. I'm 26 now, so right after college, I started getting into it, and I had no background in it, and I was kind of picking it up quickly, and I started thinking like, you just kind of get hooked. There's nothing quite
Yeah.
like it. So, and then I kind of came to the same realization, like, I'm not gonna be a UFC top contender. And so, yeah, it's I'm kind of shifting gears. I'm a personal trainer now since last fall, so I kind of shifted my career. I was working in business before doing startup
Nice.
stuff, but so yeah, that's how I got here. And what I'm interested in, what you're doing, is that uh, like I'm curious because just how does physical therapy work with combat? Since uh, I don't know. Most of the fighters that I've known, they don't like go to physical therapists all the time. They just sort of go to the gym. So,
Hmm.
are you like just from a business perspective? Are you working with like insurance companies, or are you kind of like a personal trainer that has a fit? Like, where does the certifications come into play? Like, how do you leverage those?
Sure. So it obviously depends. So right now I'm in Eastern Washington, so there's not a ton of combat athletes. I
Hmm.
do work part time at a local clinic where I see a lot of my training partners, which is primarily just jujitsu athletes. When I was in Sacramento, Sacramento had a much bigger jujitsu and mixed martial art culture, so I was able to work with more diverse martial artists. So jujitsu, mixed martial arts, kickboxing, boxing, etc. And then part time, I also do, I would call myself more as like a performance coach than a personal trainer, but that's where I work with some of these combat athletes. Where um, how do I maximize their body for jujitsu fighting? So I do a lot of joint training. I do a lot of conditioning design specifically for combat sports. And then I also touch on like some injury management where, you know, because generally physical therapy ends when someone's discharged from physical therapy, but that doesn't quite mean that they're ready to go back to sport, because there's a pretty big transition from physical therapy and rehab, and then full intensity sport. So that's kind of where I kind of like fit in that role, from the virtual sense.
Gotcha. And then, are all your clients fighters? Do you work with people just that come in from other walks of life with other injuries, or
Mhm. Yep.
yeah, okay,
Yep.
that's
I
cool.
mean, so I work with anyone. I probably work with recreational jiu-jitsu athletes the most, because generally these are people who have jobs and they can have insurance, or they or they have funds to work with me. That's the thing. Also, it's kind of interesting in the mixed martial arts world
Hmm.
is most professional athletes do not have health insurance. Because the idea is, if they get hurt in an event, the event is then liable for whatever injury. So a lot of times they'll go into a fight saying they got injured in the fight when they're really in. That's kind of what they're banking on. So um, it's
Gotcha.
literally when I say I know zero, like I know like multiple, like over a dozen UFC fighters. None of them have health insurance.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was wondering about when I alluded to the insurance before. So how does that work with when a fighter gets injured in a fight? Is the insurance company runs through the promotion that put on the fight, and
Yeah,
is and it how, on the business side, is there a lot of hoops to jump through to work with?
of course.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay, it's more so than just one of your other clients for physical therapy that isn't coming in from the fighting world with their own health
yeah,
insurance.
yeah. Because what happens is like essentially it's like a work comp injury if you think about it. So you got injured on the job. So there's a lot more. There's a lot more red tape you have to go through. Now there is more flexibility. Like I've worked with people in the UFC, and if you go if we're doing the UFC work comp, like they're getting a little bit different care than like someone who got like, who's like a desk worker that might have like slipped on the job just because the demands are so, if it was like a desk worker, we might see them twice a week versus if they were injured in a UFC event, potentially I could see them 5 days a week. And because of the nature of it, we can justify that.
Okay. And then do you have to stick to physical therapy training in those sessions, or can you also kind of go into the performance coaching realm? Like, do you have to
If
separate those
you
for
have
the
to separate
insurance?
those. Yeah,
Okay.
so like and this is the trick with insurance, right? Is like so depending on like in most cases, if you're going to go through insurance, does insurance do they care for you get back to jiu-jitsu? And the answer is no. They really don't.
Hmm.
I mean, obviously, if you're a professional athlete, slightly the rules are slightly different. But if like right now, I work with someone who's a
Gotcha.
recreational jiu-jitsu athlete, and they're like, well, I can't, like every time I do a bare bolo, I'm getting back pain. Well, and the insurance company is like, well, how do we justify this if you have full function, but it's a very sports specific thing? So that's again where generally insurance ends, and that's the problem with medical insurance is because you have to do all this justification, and it's such a hassle. That's why I wouldn't be surprised as time goes on, you're going to see much, much more of these cash based physical therapy clinics opening up where really it's just like someone comes with a problem and you address the problem. And as long as, you know, there is medical necessity, you're good to go.
Yeah. I don't know how much you've thought about it, but I know there's kind of a debate with just like the contract nature of UFC fighters and how the insurance should work or and how it does. I I don't know if you want to get into that, but do you have thoughts on that? And then also, or yeah, start with that, and then I'll have another
Well,
question.
what's the exact question? Just
What
so I'm.
what I guess from your perspective, where's the UFC at with how they treat their fighters in terms of health insurance? And do you think it's fair? And if not, do you and whether or not you think it's fair, do you have ideas on how it could be improved? Do you think the UFC could work directly with these sort of cash based physical therapy clinics or something like that? Um,
I guess you can think about it. So, what if you're in the UFC? You have free access to the UFC PI. So, that's in Vegas. But if you ever
that's
need
true.
physical therapy, you just go to the UFC PI. They cover everything. So,
Okay.
right off the bat, they get good coverage in that sense. And like when you're gonna go to the UFC PI, you're not like gonna get like 15 minutes with the therapist. Like you're gonna be probably in there for like 2 hours, 3 hours a day. So it's like you're gonna get very good medical care. However, not everyone is able to go to Nevada, but you have to think about it when you're a UFC employee, like you're not like a classic employee in the sense where you're working 40 hours a week. Like you're still an independent contractor. And with that, you get paid a certain amount. Now, what UFC athletes could do is they can go and pay for health insurance privately. Generally, how you could do it, it might be anywhere from like $300 to $500 a month. So that would just be an extra expense considering that you're an independent contractor. They elect to not do that. So ultimately, should a UFC athlete get health care? Well, one, they have access to care through the PI, and you get paid, if you're a UFC athlete for the most part, even if you're like an entry level, fighter, you could be making anywhere from around like, if you have 3 fights a year, you make 10,000 a fight, 10,000 a win, plus, you could be making like $66,000 a year. So they should be able to afford it. And then again, that's an entry level fighter. If you're, making anywhere more than that, like you could be making like $150,000 a year, considering you could take about 6,000 for health insurance. So again, these are things you have to consider.
Right. And then, so say I was a fighter and I don't fight competitively, but say I wasn't, I'm maybe making the transition from amateur to pro, somewhere in that range, and I want to make a run at it. What would you suggest I do to, like, what's worth it? What should I do to cover myself? And you kind of know injuries are probably going to happen, So what's the best way to address it? Was it focus more on education and like look at people like you online and try to learn ways to mitigate it yourself, or would you invest in health insurance and just go through it knowing that you're probably only going to get that 2 times a week? Like, what can you do as a young fighter trying to figure it out?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I do think it's probably a good idea to have health insurance as just a global thing because, shit
Mm-hmm.
happens. Like, most recently there was that famous legal case where there was this guy that he was rolling and he broke his neck and he became a quadriplegic. That stuff happens. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's if he didn't have health insurance, like that guy's medical bills are going to be millions of dollars, literally millions, you know? So like, it's probably a good idea of health insurance. Um, that being said, and this is something that I try to educate people on is, you want to try to work with the best. Like a lot of times you get what you pay for. I think if you're an athlete, your health should be your number one priority because what happens with most athletes is your ability to express your athletic ability is based on how well your body is functioning. So if your body is constantly injured, it's going to affect how well that you can fight. So again, if I want to be a professional athlete, like what's the best way that I can take care of my body? So manage injuries, make sure you're recovering from exercise, working with professionals who understand. So, not every physical therapist is the same. Generally most physical therapists in an ortho clinic, they're not sports focused. Like their focus based on insurance is again, you're having less pain, you can do most common things around the house. That's when they're going to discharge you. Like I think you really want to make sure that you can work with a sports physical therapist who can go from rehab to strength and conditioning to return to sport.
Gotcha. Is is combat physical therapist like a thing other than you? Uh, is that like no? Okay. Yeah, I
No,
don't
I
think
mean,
so, but
yeah,
I
I
had to
mean,
ask.
maybe, yeah, maybe things will change. And that's why I just put out a course on treating the jiu-jitsu athlete just because so there's a regular physical therapist, then there's the orthopedic focused specialist, there's sports focused. You have to think that generally if you're a sports physical therapist, you're primarily focusing on a field athlete, soccer, baseball, basketball, football, etc. And then obviously there's other things like lacrosse, but a lot of these other sports are very similar, right? They're generally a running sport. You're going to be cutting. There might be some hand-eye coordination with the ball. A lot of similarities. Obviously there's some slight things like soccer. Obviously, you can't touch the ball with your hands. Hockey, you're on ice and you're skating and using a stick. Lacrosse, you're running but using a stick. So, but for the most part, they're all very similar. Combat sports is completely different from any other field sport. So I do think a sport focused physical therapist is going to be more adequately trained to work with a fighter solely because that they should have a better long-term plan. Like they understand that just getting you like walking around the house without pain isn't really the end goal. They're going to have a better understanding of strength and conditioning because in my opinion strength and conditioning and rehab are the same thing. They're just on different levels of the spectrum. It's just you've injured tissue that can only be stressed so much versus once the injured tissue is healed, now we stress it, but again, the concepts are going to be the same.
Interesting. I want to ask, so we'll circle back to the course since I have specific questions about the course, but what you just said is something I think is really interesting that rehab and strength and conditioning are the same. And this is honestly kind of as I'm weighing my options, personal trainer, thinking about maybe going the physical therapy route, but not really sure how much that will help me if I want to work with fighters. And so that this is kind of what I'm weighing. And what's frustrated me about physical therapy in the past, and my history with physical therapy is just a lot of injuries. I had knee surgery when I was a kid, and then just it kind of set me out of whack, you know. So I was recurring injuries, but um, yeah, the physical therapy it's only like getting you from negative to zero. They don't focus on zero to above. And so I guess just in the physical therapy world, is the sports physical therapy a little more like focus on the zero to positive, or does even the sports physical therapy kind of start at that zero? And how yeah, what else do you have to say on the rehab to strength
So,
and conditioning?
so how I break it up, just so we're on the same page. So generally, when you think of rehab, there's going to be like five stages. So you have acute injury, that's you're rolling in jiu-jitsu, someone put a leg lock, your knee popped. Okay, so your knee just popped. Subacute phase means like, okay, maybe it's been about a month. Like you're able to walk, you don't really have a limp anymore. You're starting to do some functional movement patterns, but your knee can't handle jiu-jitsu. Like you still can't kneel or squat. Then we think of phase three, which is going to be like now we're doing more strength and conditioning. So at this point, you're able to do most functional movement patterns. You're starting to include some jujitsu. Now, when we think of rehab, generally the concept of what we're doing in rehab is going to be a concept called mechanotherapy, meaning what we do is there's injured tissue that's limiting developing muscle and strength, but we can appropriately stress that injured tissue so that it can become resilient. Once we get to a point where it's no longer injured, now we can actually progress into this strength and conditioning where we're actually trying to work on maximal strength, we're working on power development, we're working on hypertrophy, again, if that's appropriate. Phase four would be the return to sport, which is, the person's out of pain, they're doing strength and conditioning. Maybe they're doing some sport specific movements, but is their body ready for the rigors of their sport? And again, I think this is where a lot of physical therapy therapists fails. And then that fifth phase, which is going to be performance training. So now they're back to training. How can we make their body better? Okay. So I would say that most physical therapists are pretty good at phase one and two. So, like, you're in pain, they can calm the pain down, they get manage the swelling, they start to restore some movements. I think that generally at the end of phase two is when insurance is going to cut it. So that's why a lot of orthopedic physical therapists, that's kind of where they stop. I would say that the traditional sports physical therapist might be better at handling phases three and four. They have a better understanding of strength and conditioning. They understand return to sport. And again, that like having no pain does not mean that someone's able to go back and roll in jiu-jitsu at 100%. So, and like how does one define a sports physical therapist? Unfortunately, a lot of clinics just say that they're sports clinics, but really they're ortho. It sounds better. A lot of people, like, when I was a new grad, I was working at a clinic that said it was a sports clinic, but it really wasn't. It just A lot of people would rather go to a sports clinic because it sounds better. Um, when I worked in Sacramento, that was actually a legitimate sports clinic. Um, so that's kind of how I think about the rehab cycle.
And is the five phase framework that you're talking about here, is that your system that you made, or is that something you've come across? And then is that what's the course goes over? Your I wrote it down, training the jiu-jitsu athlete course. Is
Yep.
that the five
Yep.
phase? Okay.
Yeah. So that was something that I developed. It's not necessarily anything that's like groundbreaking, but just
Yeah.
that's how I was able to organize it. That makes sense to me. And then, in the course, I have like an hour lecture which looks at the rehab overview where I kind of discuss each phase, because when we're working with an athlete, there's multiple things that we're doing. So there's joint specific, general movements, and then there's sport specific. So whether it doesn't matter what your sport is, you're an athlete. If someone comes with an injury, we have to kind of focus on the joint. Does the joint do what it's supposed to from a range of motion perspective, from a stability standpoint, from a strength, and from a power? So again, whether you're football, soccer, jiu-jitsu, that's always the same. the things change now when we were working with different sports, because I guess if I'm working with a soccer player versus a jiu-jitsu athlete versus a boxer, the demands of those sports are a lot different. So at that point, if we're just doing like a classic, return to sport test for a lot of injuries in in regards to soccer, that doesn't quite mean that that athlete might be ready for jiu-jitsu, but we can extrapolate, we can take some of that data. But one of the things that we do from a sports standpoint, and again, because I'm a black belt in jiu-jitsu, I understand jiu-jitsu very well, where I can start to incorporate some jiu-jitsu movements. So like the joint might look strong, might move well, but how do they actually do when they're actually doing these things? Because you've done jiu-jitsu, I'm sure you've been with people like they just get kimura and like, man, they're like, all right, well, I can't raise my arm overhead, but I'm going to keep rolling. I'm going to tuck my hand in my belt. I'm like, dude, like that's a terrible idea. And that's something that I tried actually before as a physical therapist, which was a terrible idea. Like I hurt my shoulder. I'm like, I'm going to keep rolling. It slowed down the healing of that injury for like 2 months because I kept trying to train with no guidance.
Gotcha. And so going back to the course real quick, as a personal trainer,
Sure.
it I need to get CEUs. I'm pretty sure, is it continued education units? Is that what that's? I don't even remember. But
Yes.
um, I know your course. It's got nine, right? Nine CEUs. Is,
So, because the course is focused for physical therapists, I got 9 CEU credits for physical therapists.
okay.
I'm currently working on athletic trainers. Now, there is a lot of material that would be beneficial to a personal trainer. Um, I do have to do some more research to see how I can get it to apply to training, just because personal training, there's like multiple different organizations. So some of them might be like, if I have to apply to each organization
Yeah.
like NASM or the National Strength and Conditioning Association, obviously that makes things a little bit more complicated. you know so something I can look into, but currently it's only offered for physical therapists, and hopefully within the next week or two it's cleared for athletic trainers.
And what's the process like to get that cleared for first physical therapists and then athletic trainers?
So I'm going through an organization, and that organization has contacts with different state affiliations. So generally, like if I didn't go through this, I'd have to go by each state and say, can I get CEU credits for Washington, California? So it's kind of a big hassle. So this one organization has good standing with it. So they laid down the framework of, does this course sound like it's um, a sufficient course for physical therapists? Does the topic make sense? Is it suitable? Is it too advanced or is it too basic? What type of evidence do you use? And one of the things that I did is, because I've been kind of collecting scientific literature over the last 6 years on this topic, or more now that I think about it. But so essentially, I took all of the information that I've been gathering. So it's not just like, I mean, some of this stuff is based on my experience, which is the jiu-jitsu specific movements, because there's no literature on that. But there is a lot of literature on like injury trend data, and then from a physical demand of different combat athletes, like that stuff does exist. So I do use quite a bit of scientific literature to kind of support my claims.
Gotcha. That kind of leads me into one thing I wanted to ask, which is your current education. Like, I mean, I can just tell from this conversation, like you stay reading and you're a curious
Mhm.
person. So what is your like? You have your degrees and your certifications. So what do you do to stay up to date and to keep kind of pushing the pace forward?
So, as a physical therapist, you're supposed to do 30 hours of CEU credit every 2 years, which, that's kind of why I went the road to like actually make sure I can get credit for my course, because a lot of times, you could do weekend courses and they're great, and live courses are very valuable, but it's also a time commitment and it's like kind of a hassle when you have a family. So a lot of times people will do these like random stuff online, but just for the most part, a lot of the stuff that I've seen online are very, very basic, which is why I made sure my course is not basic. It's very thorough and specific for what you would need if you're going to treat a jiu-jitsu athlete. from a scientific background, a lot of times what I do is like a question gets posed, and then I'm curious about it, and then I'll look into what PubMed, Google Scholar, anything that I can find on the subject. So you know, my whole Instagram started because so literally my Instagram started because I was a brown belt. I was rolling with a purple belt. I straight footlock him, and he's like, "Oh, dude, I don't play that footlock stuff." I'm like, "A straight ankle lock's legal white belt gi, like in kids tournaments. Like, it's a straight ankle lock is not a heel hook. Those are two different things." And I was getting so frustrated because and I like leg locks. I think they're safe. And a lot of times people were terrified of heel hooks. So like, "Oh, we can't do them. My knee's going to explode." So I started to actually like look into some research, like from a kinesiology standpoint, like what's actually happening to the knee when you apply these motions. So obviously I got as has gone on, I've found more literature, I've dug deeper, so I was able to collect these things. But again, a question would be posed to me and then I'll do the dive. So for me, like when I was doing that course, I had collected a lot of information already, so it was fairly easy. But more questions would pop up, and then I'd have to research. So another thing that I'm going to start working on is, so this course originally was going to be treating the combat athlete. The problem was it's 9 hours solely on grapplers. So if I added striking, that'd be like another 9 hours. So I was like, okay, why don't I just break them into two separate courses? Because even though martial arts as a whole are different from field athletes, a striking athlete and a grappling athlete are vastly different. I mean, yes, they're both doing martial arts and there's some type of competitive thing, but like what you're doing is not the same. A lot of times people kind of get lumped in like, "Oh, you work with martial artists," even though this person has either no background of striking or no background in grappling. Thankfully, I have a background in both striking and grappling, so I can talk about both. So that's kind of like the next project that I'm going to work on, which is treating the striking athlete. And I'm actually really excited about that because you have to think with jujitsu. Jujitsu really kind of like became famous after, UFC 193. Really didn't really get any type of like scientific work until like, I would say like the jujitsu um, competition scene really didn't start becoming like mainstream across like the US and the world until like, like late 2000s. So there's not that much stuff on it. But like you think when it comes to striking, like boxing has been around forever. So, trying to, for me, like to kind of like go over like the biomechanics of like a punch, like how do we generate a punch is like fascinating to me. So that's kind of like a fun project that I'm looking forward to working on.
Yeah, I'm curious on the striking aspect. What can you do for the head? Is it neck work or I mean that's the worst place to
Well,
get hit. So what kinds of what as you kind of make that program and have people coming in with questions, what's your approach become
when you
for
say with the head, you mean like to
like
avoid head trauma?
yeah, head trauma specifically, like concussions?
Okay, so I talk a little bit about this in the jiu-jitsu course. Even though it's focused on jiu-jitsu, I had so much stuff on concussion. I had to keep it. There's three main things we're looking at to avoid a concussion. One is we have to make sure that we can see the strike, because if you can't see the strike, it doesn't matter. You can't avoid it because you can't see it. So we look at vision training. Then we have to have reaction training, meaning we see the strike, can we react appropriately, whether we're trying to avoid it or brace. And then the last component is neck strength, because if I see the strike and then I brace, I need to make sure my neck is strong enough to absorb the blow. So that's from a concept. We look at vision, reaction, neck training. Then there's different types of things. So, you know, people don't realize, but like strength isn't strength. There's a lot of different components. So a lot of things that I do personally when I'm working with someone is we can do like I start people with neck strengthening with like various isometrics, but then we could do like a fast ballistic isometric, which is like, can I brace really fast? We can focus on eccentric. So again, as the strikes come, can my neck actually absorb the blow? So there's different ways that I can strengthen the neck from an isometric, eccentric way, which I use to kind of mitigate neck and head injuries.
Interesting. Um, the reaction training, the second part of that is that like about the um the ballistic bracing? Is that what you called it? Is that the reaction training, or is that part of the strength training? I'm curious specifically about
Uh,
the reaction
well,
training.
yeah, I mean it's a little bit of both, like because I have to make sure that again, if I can't brace my neck fast enough, it really doesn't matter how strong my neck is. So part of it is, can I make sure that I can contract my muscle as quick as possible? But reaction in general is like awareness of a strike. So there's a lot of different ways that we can train it, and there's a lot of stuff out there. But again, like, can we actually respond to a stimulus fast enough to have the appropriate response?
Gotcha. I'm curious about your personal training. Obviously you
Sure.
train jujitsu, and then I'm
Mhm.
curious from both a rehab or kind of like a prehab perspective, and then a strength and conditioning perspective. How do you kind of balance all those things, and what's your routine like?
So I try to train about 5 days a week. It really depends on my work schedule and what's going on. I try to do 5 days a week. Sometimes it's more, some days it's less. Generally, what I've been doing is personally, now that I'm going to gear up and I'm going to try to do a competition sometime in the near future. I'm starting to ramp up my conditioning. So generally, what I'll do is after jujitsu, if I have time, I'm going to start doing some aerobic conditioning training. I probably do strength, like pure barbell strength work, maybe like once a week. And then throughout the week, I do a lot of joint and mobility training. Um, and this way that, because one, when it comes to strength training, I have to make sure that my whole goal when I work with my clients is, if we're going to do strength training, I want to do the minimal amount of stress to get the adaptation required. So again, depending on someone's goal, they might be able to get a sufficient adaptation with like 1 day a week of training. Again, it depends on the person, where they are, and what their goals are. This way that they can use that extra energy towards skill training, right? Because strength matters, of course, um, but I still would argue that skill training is the most important thing. Sometimes people go too far that way. They only do skill training, which again, I don't think that's the answer. It really depends on the person. So if I'm looking at an athlete, like, where is their downside? Are they having too many injuries? So have they not addressed these injuries, which are causing these movement faults or these compensations? Are they suffering from a cardiovascular deficit? Like, again, like, and I've talked about this a lot. Like, if your cardio is not good, you can't just roll and think your cardio is going to get better. Like, there's other things that you can do. From a strength perspective, like, again, strength matters. Like, if you're weak, like, it doesn't matter. You go with someone, if they're much stronger. Unfortunately, that, you if you have two people and your technique is similar, but somebody's stronger, the stronger person's going to win because they have the advantage, right? So, you know, it depends on the person and the athlete and what they need. And I've gone through all sorts of phases even before as a physical therapist, because when I was fighting, I didn't really do any strength work. Um, Ironically, the only conditioning I did was because I thought I needed to run to make weight. So I actually did a lot of conditioning, but not for conditioning, even though it grass, like, I didn't realize, I'm like, oh, that's why my cardio is good, is because I run all the time. Um, I Ironically, I wasn't planning on retiring when I did, because I never officially retired. I started doing strength work like the week after my fight, because I was like, all right, well, my deficit at that time was I wasn't strong enough, so I started doing some strength work. And anyway, so because I've gone through it, I have a better understanding, because I've been that guy who just did skill training, and I've worked with people who don't address their injuries, and I've also worked with people who don't actually just do enough jujitsu.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting concept that goes over a lot of people's head, but like once you get to the point where you're really trying to be elite, it becomes a lot of people, they're just at the stage where they're trying to just get up to work capacity, they're trying to just move to be healthy, but at a certain level it's all about efficiency. It's you're going to be moving the maximum amount. How can you get the most out of that time? And so,
Right.
kind of on that note, I'm curious both for yourself and for your clients. And maybe it's the same, maybe it's different. But when you're training, how structured is your approach? Like, do you program in like progressive overload in a structured way, or do you just kind of, is it more creative and you overload complexity over time, or how does that
It
work?
it depends on the person. So some people do, like, for strength and cardio. Like, so generally, like, we have a block, right? So we might have a 4 to 6 week block, and like, what's our focus for that? So generally, we can kind of work on multiple things, but really one thing is going to be the focus. So I feel like I might do like a linear progression of progressive overload for like strength work, or I might do a progressive overload for conditioning. Sometimes I'll use like auto regulation. So I like reps in reserve a lot because that gives you a little bit better understanding of like, if today I'm not feeling great, I'm still doing what I can, because obviously there's going to be daily fluctuations. Um, and for me, that allows me to kind of work. So like when I do my strength work, it generally is high intensity, low volume. Um, and that by doing reps in reserve, it allows me to do that heavy work without like completely frying my central nervous system. So I like that one a lot. Um, when it comes to joints training, again, that's usually kind of like a linear progression of adding intensity, building up, adding concepts of, because when I do joint training, so I do a lot of functional range conditioning training. Um, if you've never actually done like specific joints training, like your body's not really ready for it. So first, when I work with people, I'm exposing to them, I'm getting them used to movements they've probably never done. Then we can start adding different complexity levels of, again, it could be a ballistic isometric, could be focus on eccentrics, whatever the focus is for that block.
Interesting. And then is on the recovery side of it, is there stretching or myofascial treatment or anything like that involved, or are you able to kind of accomplish that with like what you're saying, functional range motion? Like, does that kind of mitigate some of the need for that, or how does that the recovery uh, fit into all this?
So if you think about recovery, the three most important things you could do is going to be load management, sleep, and nutrition. So we stress our body, we have to recover through sleep. So if we don't sleep, we're going to affect our recovery. So we're not going to get that adaptation, right? Nutrition, whatever we put in our body, is our fuel, both our fuel source and the building blocks to rebuild our body. And then load management, again, this is probably the biggest thing that I do when I'm working with my clients, is someone comes to me, they're a jiu-jitsu athlete, they're like, all right, well, I'm doing 5 days a week of jiu-jitsu, and then I'm doing like 5 days a week of like circuit training. So it's like, so you're doing like 10 high intensity sessions. No wonder why you're not recovering, right? So when it comes to adding an exercise, it's progressive overload. It's a great exposure to new activity. And a lot of times, and this is why partly when I do my conditioning, I like doing more low intensity, high duration, because one, it's something that you don't really get trained while you're doing skill training, because your heart rate's going too high. You're not getting the aerobic adaptations you're looking for. But also by doing these low intensity, high duration, it's also like an active recovery to recover from the high intensity skill training workout. So where does manual therapy fit in? Obviously massage can reduce some delayed muscle onset soreness, and it's there. Generally, if I'm working with someone in person, I'm doing manual therapy. I don't do a classic massage because, again, like whether you're doing a massage, a foam roller, if you're just doing that for exercise, like to release soreness, I don't think it's that complex. Generally, if I'm going to do manual therapy, I do something called functional release, which is still focus on function. How do I maximize their body? And I don't really care if it feels good or it doesn't feel good. My goal, I have an objective, which is their body doesn't do what it's supposed to. How can I make sure that it does what it's supposed to?
Gotcha. Um, One thing I just made a note I wanted to ask you about. And this is I'm trying to ask you sort of more broad questions. This one's just sort of a random specific thing that's come up for me a couple times in the last week, so it's been on my mind. But I'm curious about shaking and like when you're doing a movement, especially like an isometric hold, and your body's shaking. What I've seen come up, and it's just on like Instagram and stuff like that. So not vetted the quality
Sure.
of the information, but what I'm understanding is that there's a higher neurological response to these movements when you're shaking, and the brain is what initiates all hypertrophy and development in general. So by doing these movements that require shaking, you're triggering your brain to give the biggest response. Do you have anything to talk about on shaking, or is that something you think about much, or is this just something that's a trend on Instagram, maybe.
I would flip the what's happening. So generally, if I'm doing isometric training, if I'm trying to recruit as much motor units as possible, and again, if you do isometrics, and this is why I build people up, is most people think they're doing a high intensity isometric. They probably aren't unless they've been doing it over and over again. As we start to recruit more muscle fibers, our bodies, we're getting activation elsewhere on our body, which presents as shaking. So I don't think shaking is necessarily the goal. I think it's a byproduct of high intensity isometric work.
Gotcha. But you could also be doing high intensity work, recruiting similar levels of motor units without the shaking, is what you're.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
understood. Um, cool, man. Well, I don't want to take all your time. That's all I had to ask. But I really appreciate you coming on. This I really learned a lot. You've got a lot of information up there, so it's
Thanks, man.
appreciate you letting me tap into it.
No
Um,
problem, man. I appreciate you having me.
yeah, awesome. Well, I'll end this recording here.